for about a dozen years now, I've been working as an independent consultant doing work in schools primarily around sexual orientation, gender and gender identity. So I said I would talk a little bit about some of what we know about attitudes amongst young people with regard to that, and also about the work that we're doing or that is going on to try and make things better for some people. But before I do that, let me talk about this resource. So some of you will be aware of an Ofsted report 2012, No Place for Bullying. And one of the things that No Place for Bullying identified was the very high levels of prejudice-based bullying that went on in schools, and how particularly that was focused on children with disabilities and LGBTQI young people. So the CSIE, Centre for Studies on Inclusive Education, which has, I have been a board member of for a few years, but it's been around for quite a long time. And some of you may remember something called the Index for Inclusion, which was a kind of really the kind of standard document for supporting young people with disabilities in education for quite a long time. They've, in the last few years, they've expanded their remit to all areas of equality, with, again, they have a particular interest in LGBTQI stuff as well. But they put together a focus group of some of their friendly schools in response to this initial report and said, well, what would you find useful? What would be handy? And everybody agreed that they didn't just want another resource on one kind of area of equality, because one of the things that CSI, I think, has always been very focused on is that rather grand word, intersectionality. I'll come back to that in a moment. So the aim of this part is to have enough detail to make it useful, but to be succinct as well. As part of the process, we worked with 8 schools, so a lot of the case studies, little examples of work you'll see in here will come from those schools. Others have been gathered from partner organisations. I'll talk a little bit about them in a minute. But if I can tell you really what the thinking behind it was again, and what we're hoping to achieve. So obviously, the key thing was to address prejudice and discrimination across the school. Again, in a second, I'll talk a little bit about why we've got these sections here. It's very helpful, I think, as a tool. It's not labelled as an anti-bullying tool. One of my little obsessions, I think, throughout most of my working career is that most bullying is actually an equalities issue. And a lot of work that just looks at bullying behaviour isn't really dealing with the underlying issues. So that was something I think we were very aware of when we were putting this together. So it is aimed at everybody in the school community. It is for primary and secondary schools, and a little bit of trumpet blowing. The Zero Project Initiative, which campaigns for better conditions for disabled people the world over, gave it its Innovative Practice Award, which is very exciting. So we're very thrilled about that. So what's actually in here? So you've got on this side something about each of the equalities strands. And what's very nice is if I took out the one on sex and gender identity and read the top here, it says, whatever a person's sex or gender identity may be, they also have a sexual orientation, an ethnic, cultural and socioeconomic background. You can see where I'm going with this. The point being to try and kind of stop people falling into that trap of thinking, well, she's a young Muslim woman, I know what she needs. Because of course everybody has all those identities going on. And one of the problems, I think, if you are a member of a minority, so in this country, for example, if you're not white, if you're not heterosexual, if you do have a disability, it's very interesting how that sometimes becomes the only thing that people can see about you. And you notice it with the way that we identify people, don't we? You never say, oh, you know, the white heterosexual bloke. That's no good, there's too many of them. But, you know, the gay guy, the disabled woman, I mean, that happens all the time, the Muslim lady. You know, you hear that stuff going on all the time. And it is indicative of how we kind of narrow those people's identities down. So we're very keen to avoid that happening. So we've also got a section here on kind of core and fundamental values, and there's something on the back of that about developing your equality policy. Now, Catherine's already pointed out that equality policies are like hen's teeth in schools, but there are some good examples out there, and this makes the point that really it is the starting point really for a lot of the stuff that you want to be doing. We've got some key stuff on the law. This side looks at all those different kind of aspects of school life. So it looks at behaviour, looks at leadership, looks at the learning environment. So this is not, for example, a curriculum tool specifically, but there's lots of stuff in here that you could use to help you with auditing equalities across your curriculum. There are, talking of auditing, there are little questionnaires here for use with students, with even quite young children, parents, teachers, governors, which you can use as a kind of a snapshot. where are we? You can use them as a kind of monitoring tool. The idea is again that they're kind of flexible and adaptable. Obviously, it is not totally comprehensive. It couldn't be anything this size, but the idea is to point people in the direction of resources and help. There's a lovely exercise on the front. You will be familiar with show races in the red card. They have a very nice exercise which they allowed us to adapt, which they call burning issues. Has anybody come across that? It's basically about creating a safe space for young people to talk about, ask any question they want to about inequalities in schools. And one of the really nice things, one of those things you think, gosh, I wish I'd thought of that. They do a thing at the end, and this is not unusual in itself, everybody gets an opportunity to write something down. So if the question didn't get answered or they didn't want to ask it in the group, they can write the question down. And what they say to everybody is, if you haven't got any questions, if you can just write down, I haven't got any questions today, which means that you end up with a box not with 3 bits of paper in, but a box with 33 bits of paper in. So it's just much easier not to find out who asked the question. So if your concern is about anonymity, you'll feel much more confident putting your bit of paper in a box with 35 other bits of paper. Simple but clever, I thought. Many of you will be aware of this, thinking about attitudes of young people. There's this YouGov report that told us all that half 18 to 24-year-olds don't identify themselves as being 100% heterosexual, which was quite surprising to a lot of people. Now that's not to say, of course, that a lot of those people are necessarily having relationships or have had relationships with people of the same sex, but they're certainly not ruling it out as a possibility. That feels like a really kind of positive step forward. Less well reported was the fact that 20% of young men in that same, only 2% of young men in that same age group regarded themselves as completely masculine. They had a little scale of, I think it was kind of 1 to 8, masculinity and femininity, and quite a lot of people ended up sort of edging towards the middle, which seemed very positive, and you might think from that, well, actually, this could lead to real kind of acceptance of kind of non-binary identities and all that kind of stuff. And then a few weeks ago, out comes the latest Stonewall School report, which tells us, so getting on for half young people have faced direct online abuse linked to their sexual orientation or their gender identity, and nearly all of them have seen stuff out there. And I think this is actually quite a big change for us, for people, certainly people of my age anyway. I'm having quite a lot of conversations with young people about things like what's going on in Chechnya. And I don't think we would have known that necessarily, when I was a teenager. I don't think we would have known about stuff like that. So the perception, which in itself is not true, but the perception that if you live in Western Europe and you're LGBTQI, it's probably kind of okay, and there might be a bit of bullying and stuff like that. And maybe you can't necessarily be out at work, but yeah, it's basically fine. Even though, we've seen from what Catherine was saying that that's far from being the case. Even those young people whose families are very accepting, who happen to be in a school where they can be open about who they are, they know that there's all this other stuff going on, and they find that very disturbing, and it isn't being discussed at all in classrooms. And then really, shockingly to me, still, even in things like PSHE and SRE, nothing inclusive. And if you kind of focus in a little bit on young trans people, so yeah, we have this thing, we've had the public sector equality duty since 2010, gender reassignment is a protected characteristic. And yet, 1 in 3 of them are not allowed to use their preferred name. That's not legal. You can't be doing that. People have a right to be living in their preferred gender, or use toilets that are appropriate for them. And then we look at these, we endlessly cycle these kind of depressing statistics, don't we? I wonder why. So we've still got a way to go. So, yeah, there's a long way to go with all this. And I think some of those headline statistics, that it's great to see that younger people seem to be more open to different identities than older people, but in fact what it looks like on the ground is very different. And young people in schools are very aware of this as well. And actually they're quite cynical about some of those statements. Like, it's getting better now, it's all great, And it's quite interesting, I remember as I think I'm now officially an older gay man, end quote, how some of my chums got quite sort of bitter and twisted a few years ago, and it seemed like all the young people, they took it all for granted, and all the battles we went through, and all the fights we fought, and now they just want to go out clubbing, and I have to say I never went into all that nonsense. But in actual fact, we're actually seeing kind of a swing back now, and a lot of young, particularly young trans or non-binary young people, but also a lot of young LGBTQ young people are not feeling, LGBTQ young people are not feeling anything like as comfortable and welcome in the world as one might hope. On a sort of wider agenda, I do a lot of work around gender stereotypes and the sort of things that affect all young people. I actually think a lot of the issues around homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying are actually to do with gender stereotypes and things like that. I remember Quentin Crisp, who said a lot of very clever things and a lot of very, very stupid things. But one of the things he said, which was kind of silly, but I really loved, he said that it's not homosexuality that the British have a problem with, it's effeminacy. They don't even like effeminate women. And I thought, there's a little kernel of something really interesting in that, I think. So I was involved in a project with the NUT called the Breaking the Mould Project, and we worked with a group of primary schools to think about how you could challenge, how you could address some of those gender stereotypes in schools. Because that is the reality of it. So again, although the world may be changing, interestingly, if you're a child, if you're a little child, most of you, unless you're unlucky enough to have to go to hospital and things like that, you're more likely to have met a woman doctor than a man doctor. But you'll still draw men when somebody says draw a doctor. Because that's what the world is telling you. And the impact of that is very significant. At the same time, to be more positive, young people are very able to, want to actually talk to them about this stuff, but you do need to talk to them. You do need to say, hang on, is that actually right? They will very quickly start noticing how they are being told, how they're being marketed at by organisations who would like their parents to spend twice as much money on toys and books and clothes and things like that. And they will also buy into the idea that anybody can do anything. But of course, buying into it in a lesson is a specific lesson, or as part of a drama activity or something, is much less than actually really buying into it in life. So it's why we need to have a real kind of holistic approach to this in schools, I think. These are a couple of much older quotes. So this is from about 10 years ago, a project I did called No Outsiders, which was the first kind of large-scale research project looking at how you can do sexualities, equalities work in primary schools. This comment from a teacher, I think, speaks for itself. That top one was from a Year 5 boy. So we were talking about big words, discrimination, prejudice, and I said, what's the stereotype? And he said, well, stereotypes stop you doing stuff. And I said, that's very interesting, how do you mean? He said, well, if you're a boy, you're supposed to like this, if you're a girl, you're supposed to like that. Perfect. Bingo. And I liked it so much that years later, when we came to write this resource for the NUT project, we kept it. But it's worth reminding us at this point what a proper girl looks like. So that is what a proper girl looks like, that is what a proper boy looks like. And one of the things that I spend quite a lot of time talking to teachers and other people about is how we sometimes inadvertently just constantly reiterate those stereotypes and the language you use, and how if we could just stop doing that stuff, how much better things might be for starters. But some young people helped me find these images in books that are not actually necessarily representative of the truth of what's actually going out there in the real world. Who is doing the jobs in books, or frankly, the people doing jobs in books. But it's not all bad. There are jobs for women out there, and if you don't, if that doesn't appeal to you, there are also ways out of that. There are solutions. And these things, if you say them enough, they become facts. I am too pretty to do maths. And then at the bottom it says dumb blonde. So that is being sold as a desirable thing for little girls. And on the other side of the coin, we have this fascinating bit of research. Boys actually know that they're less clever than girls. They've learned that now. Here we are, rubbing our hands, those of us who work in education, about boys and achievement. And what have we achieved? We've made them feel more stupid than girls. We've made them feel there's no point trying because girls are cleverer than we are. I think some of the things that we do, so this is a little thing from another resource that I've done for NT, which is about reading. And I was very excited to be able to do that because we were actually able to do it from a kind of equalities perspective, but actually picking out the fact that a lot of these initiatives that have been put in place, or schools have been encouraged to do around raising boys' achievement, there's absolutely no evidence that they work, and in fact there's an increasing body of evidence that they don't work, and that they're counterproductive. Body of research, this is from 2008, this is from the last couple of years. Becky Francis and Christine Skelton, if you haven't come across them, check out their work. They've been writing about this for years, very academically rigorous work about the fact the way to do this is not to throw special stuff at people, it's to break down those preconceptions about what boys and girls do and like. And again, and we haven't even talked about, and I'm afraid we haven't got time to talk about, sexual bullying, the pressure on girls to look and be certain ways, the pressure on boys to behave in certain ways. And I think all that brings us back again to what we started talking about around sexual orientation and gender identity and bullying. All of that is kind of wrapped up together. I spend quite a lot of time talking about curriculum. This stuff fits quite neatly and easily. People can see how it fits into literature and arts, but it really has to be in there everywhere, because otherwise you can actually undo the good stuff that you're doing in literature and arts. I still keep seeing lessons about scientists who are always men. And I was looking at one recently, it wasn't just about him, it was about his wife and children. So he was being a scientist and they were being his wife and children, you know, stuff like that. And on the subject of that one, very, very few resources like this. I've got a copy of this here if anybody's interested in SRE. This is a fantastic, inclusive SRE resource. It's not just LGBTQI inclusive, it's inclusive of surrogacy, of adoption, of IVF, of single families, of much more complex families. It's very, very clever how it gets all the biology in there, but it also gets all those identities and all those relationships in as well. A question I think is always worth asking young people is how actually, really, bit of empathy, are people, is it possible to be open in the school? And I think Catherine would agree that very often the answer to that is not. But that is often the starting point for thinking about what would you need to have in place to ensure that it does happen. So it's about, there's also important stuff about creating spaces, but ultimately, you know, we shouldn't need a gay prom. But everybody should be able to go to the same prom. Apropos of that, it's very difficult, I've found, to find positive, non-traumatised, non-sentimentalised young trans people. Say hello to Leo. You know about Leo. Leo is just a fabulous young man. CBeebies have made a documentary about him. You can read his anti-bullying tips and things like that. But that kind of resource is actually really quite hard to find. So again, you know, to take us back where we started, it is important, I think, to talk about the bullying stuff. But whenever I do it, I always try to do it rather than saying this is what you say. I try to think, well, what kind of response could you make? So could you challenge that? Could you question it? If you can't do that, or you don't feel confident to do that, could you just make a kind of assertive statement which links to school policy? You know, this is what we don't do this here, do we? Because, you know, so everybody has got a kind of range of options, I think, rather than just kind of just a standard put down. I mean, I do agree that actually, you know, the quick "you do realise that's homophobic, don't you?" response is actually quite handy as well. But a lot of younger children won't really understand what the problem is when you say something like that. So sometimes we do have to have the discussion. I think we need to actively encourage as well. The thing about going back to the inclusive school, it's not just about saying you're inclusive. You actually have to support people and encourage people, and it's around sports, and it's around play, and it's around subject choices and all that kind of stuff. If we could just get away from making choices for children, pink stickers for girls, blue stickers for boys. I still go into primary schools where at the end of lunchtime they line them up as girls and boys. And you think, would you do white kids, everybody else? Kids with disabilities, everybody else? You'd think that was weird. But we are so invested in the men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing that we think it's an appropriate way to separate children. We just tell them that they're different and ignore the similarities. So if we could just stop doing that.